My name is Tamara Rasberry. I'm an HR practitioner with many years of experience in the HR field. And as Deborah said, I work a lot in the area of mental health in the workplace, psychological safety, employee engagement, employee experience, things of that nature. But we're not here to talk about me. So Deborah, if you would like to move on. So wanted to get started with just a poll to see where your heads are at in terms of the number of Black or Brown employees in the technology space.
Sorry, 1 second on the poll. I'm pulling it up now. I just need to pull it through.
While we wait, I'll just give you all a heads up that in the way I present is going to be like we're having a conversation. It's not going to be me standing up here stiff like a college professor. So you may hear some ain'ts, you may hear some gonas, you may hear, different things like that. It's all informational. If the poll is too much trouble, Deborah, we can skip it. I don't want us to not have time.
Yeah, let's skip the poll for now. Sorry about that.
Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm basically going to be covering 4 different topics today. Understanding microaggressions and the different classifications of racial microaggressions specifically, giving you some examples of racial microaggressions in the workplace, and then moving on to an overview of mental health and the impact that racial microaggressions have on mental health, and then finally, ways to address racial microaggressions in the workplace and support employees, including yourself as an employee. Next slide, please. So I hope you all can see this chart. I pulled it together from some employment data from Bureau of Labor Statistics and also from 3 of the major tech companies in the country. And I thought it was just interesting to show the numbers in comparison to the racial demographics, how many employees in different demographics overall are employed in the tech space, and then comparatively to like Google, Twitter, and Meta. As you can see, there's still a lot of work to be done in hiring non-white people in the tech space, and microaggressions and discrimination are one of the major reasons that you don't see more of them. Either the people aren't getting hired or they're getting hired and then they're deciding to leave because of negative experience. Also, you can go to the next slide. So before I get into what microaggressions are, I just wanted to mention that even though the Philly Most Diverse Tech Hub is sponsoring this workshop, and I'm going to include some information that is about tech employees specifically, but mainly it's just going to be about any type of employees because microaggressions can happen to anyone, racial microaggressions can happen to anyone in any field or space. So the remainder of the presentation isn't necessarily going to be specific to tech employees, but you can definitely use the same information. So what are microaggressions? I'm sure most of you have heard the term microaggressions in some way, shape, or form. And they really are the everyday verbal and nonverbal slight snubs or insults that people receive based on being a member of a marginalized community. So if you're in a community or you identify with a group that is not the majority or the group that holds the power in that space, then you're very likely to experience some form of microaggression. In many cases, these hidden messages may invalidate the group identity or experience of the people that the microaggression is being directed to. You can go to the next slide, please. So different microaggressions may send slightly different messages, but the overarching message is really that you are different, that you're not like me, that you don't look, sound, or behave like I do, or it makes you some way inferior, and that makes me uncomfortable being around you. It could also be something along the lines of, you're different than how I expected you to be because of your race, or other type of identity. It is important to note that microaggressions can be experienced by members of any marginalized community or underrepresented community based on their identity. Again, if that identity doesn't align with who is the majority in that environment. Again, we're going to be focusing on racial microaggressions here and how they may manifest in the work. Just to give you a little bit of background, the term racial microaggressions was first coined in the 70s by Dr. Chester Pierce. The concept is also rooted in a theory that was developed by two other doctors called aversive racism. And aversive racism basically says that because a lot of white people are well-intentioned and they consciously believe and profess inequality, but they unconsciously act in racist ways, especially in ambiguous situations. So with that, how that comes up for us as in the workplace as racial microaggressions is that people, are hesitant to believe that something that they've said or done has negatively impacted another person because they believe that they're a good person. Moving on to the classifications of racial microaggressions specifically, there are three classifications of racial microaggressions, which were first proposed in 2007 by Dr. Daryl Wing Su. And they are micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults. So this classification was really to separate the different types of microaggressions that you may experience. Some may be conscious, some may be unconscious, or some may be subtle, not as egregious. So obviously if someone says something like, you people don't know how to act, that's different than, I can't think of it right now, but I have a whole chart on it. So for example, like this page says, a micro assault would be something, very egregious, using the N-word, for example. Micro invalidations and micro insults are more along the lines of not believing that you're good enough or smart enough or deserving enough for either that job, that salary, or something of that nature. Next slide, please, Deborah. So in this chart, I'm really showing that there are different themes that most microaggressions fall under. One is the alienating your own land theme, which is where people assume that you're not born in the US because of how you look. So comments could be, where are you from? Or you speak very well, or things like that. When you're very much born in America, there's no reason why you wouldn't speak well or speak English well, but they make that assumption because of your outward appearance. Another one is description of intelligence. So that could go either way, it could go up or down. If they perceive you to be very intelligent, it could be oh, you're intelligent for a Black person, or you're smarter than I thought you would be. But it could also go negatively in the assumption that you shouldn't be intelligent, you shouldn't be articulate, you shouldn't be experienced or knowledgeable enough in your field to be able to give someone information about that field. So it could go either way. Color blindness is another one that I know a lot of you have heard of. It's when people say, I don't see color. I don't care if you're Black, brown, green, or yellow. Ain't nobody Black, brown, green, or yellow. You're like, well, ain't nobody green or yellow. Y'all know what I mean, is when people don't, or people say things like, there's only one race, the human race, which is denying the impact that the racial designations that people have been given in this society have an impact on their lives. So whether you want to say, I don't care what a person's race is, or I don't see color, or I have a Black friend, so I can't be racist. None of those things negate the experiences that people are having in this society or in the workplace just because you want to say you don't believe in it. Next slide, please, Deborah. Another theme is denial of individual racism, and that's along, like I said in the last one, I'm not racist because I have Black friends, or if you share your experience with someone, they'll say like, are you sure that happened? Did that really happen that way? I'm sure you took it the wrong way, and it's just all this denial of your actual experience because they don't believe that something like that could have happened, that society is like that, or that Jane down the hall is like that. So they deny the experience. Assumption of criminal intent and wrongdoing. So that is along the lines of you're automatically assuming if something bad happened, if something got stolen, or if money was embezzled from the company or something like this, there's an automatic assumption that the person in the environment who is not white is the person who must have committed it. And then the myth of meritocracy, which is along the lines of color blindness, but it's saying that the belief that people always get what they deserve. So, the best person for the role should get the role, doesn't matter what race they are, or everyone has the same opportunities. Everyone can, succeed if they want to, if they work hard enough and things like that, where we know that's not necessarily the truth, okay? So many times people do not get hired, do not get opportunities, do not get promotions because of their race. It's very clear in research, and it's very clear in people's individual experiences. So that whole belief that if you just work hard enough, you'll be able to get where other people get is just a myth. And and if someone makes a statement like that to you, it is considered a microaggression. Next slide, please, Deborah. So now we're going to move specifically to racial aggressions in the workplace. So these are examples of the 3 classifications of racial microaggressions that I mentioned earlier, but how they could play out specifically in the workplace. And I want to note that most of the information that I find in research on racial microaggressions in the workplace specifically is based on experiences of Black employees. So as I discuss this topic, I will mainly refer to Black employees. I don't use the term BIPOC, I don't use the term people of color, and I feel like Black or brown is really cumbersome to say repeatedly. But I do want to clarify that you absolutely do not have to be Black to experience racial microaggressions, either in the workplace or out. It's just most of the information that I've gathered through studying this topic speaks to Black people, Black employees specifically, and that's where I'm going with in this information. But I'm interested to see in the chat how this is kind of going in a different direction, but I'm still interested in seeing how you all feel about using the terms like BIPOC or people of color. Like, is it something that you use, or is it something that you would prefer not to use? I'm just always interested in hearing how people feel about those terms. But speaking specifically to racial microaggressions in the workplace, they can include a white employee assuming that a Black employee is of a lesser employment status. Say, for example, we've all seen things where someone has walked into an interview and assumed that the Black woman was the receptionist and not knowing that they were actually the president of the company, you know, and not because they were sitting at the receptionist desk, just because they happen to be Black. Also asking your Black coworker if they can do things that are like get you a cup of coffee or make copies for you, when none of that is part of their role. And you wouldn't ask a white colleague to do that, but you're asking your Black employee to do that. And the one that we always hear about, asking a Black woman or man actually, if you can touch their hair. You know, your hair is so exotic. Can I please touch it? Absolutely not. If you specifically request a Black supervisor because you just feel, a white supervisor, because you feel like the Black supervisor isn't equipped to manage you, or you don't want to be managed by a Black person, you feel uncomfortable with it. You know, asking someone how they got their job, like, how did you get hired for this? Like, you know, how did you get to be a senior executive and I'm only this, you know, how did you? And definitely someone using a term such as like you people or those people, like those are very much aggressive statements that classify as racial microaggressions. Next slide, please. I want to also bring up the very important topic of intersectionality. So even though we are discussing racial microaggressions specifically, it's important to note that people who are of a certain race but have other identities such as being a woman, being queer, having a disability, being neurodivergent, or something of that nature, touches on, could touch on them experiencing even more racial microaggressions because of the intersectionality of those identities. Like this slide says, according to the World Economic Forum, 36% of Black women who experience microaggressions within the workplace were more likely to quit their jobs within 2 years. A lot of the research and information that I have read shows that Black women specifically experience much higher rates of racial microaggressions in the workplace than people of other races or genders. Next slide, please, Deborah. So, let it be known that working remotely absolutely does not protect us from experiencing microaggressions. We know that over the last couple of years, since the COVID pandemic started, a lot more Black employees have had, or I should say Black office-bound employees have had the opportunity to work remotely. And in some ways that has been a really significantly positive experience because you're not dealing with those day-to-day, very in-your-face type of microaggressions, but there are still things that can be microaggressions that you experience virtually, such as asking about items that are in your background, that are cultural or personal to you. Asking something like, I hear a lot of sirens. Like, do you live in a hood? Should we worry about you getting shot? Something like that. And then also, because the meetings tend to be virtual a lot, it could be completely just ignoring the person instead of giving them a chance to talk in the meeting. Or just when it's their time to talk, it's time for the meeting to end. Things like that. Things that could be experienced in the workplace, but also could very well be experienced remotely. So I just think it's important to know that a lot of people, I hear a lot of people saying like they want to work remotely so they don't have to experience these type of things, but you should really know that you can definitely still experience some types of microaggressions even when you work remote. Next slide, please, Deborah. So now that you have an understanding of what microaggressions are and what racial microaggressions are specifically, and what they may look like in the workplace, I'm going to move on to discussing mental health and how these microaggressions impact employee mental health. But before I do that, since we didn't get the opportunity to do the poll earlier, I just want to take a couple of minutes and ask if anyone has any questions about what I've already discussed. If so, you can drop them in the chat or raise your hand. Preferably drop them in the chat because I can't see all the people's faces.
If anyone raises their hand, I'm happy to unmute you, or you're welcome to drop any questions in the chat.
If not, I will move on. So, no. I didn't mean move to the next slide. I just meant move on because nobody had any questions. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their. I know that when we think about mental health, we're not necessarily thinking about it in those terms, but that is just the definition that the World Health Organization uses. Now, please move to the next slide. So again, when we talk about mental health, we're talking about our overall mental well-being, our emotions, our thoughts and feelings, our ability to solve problems and overcome difficulties, the levels of our social connections, and our general understanding of the world around us. People tend to equate the term mental health with a mental illness or a mental health disorder, and they're not interchangeable. They're not the same thing. A mental illness is something that is diagnosable, something like post-traumatic stress disorder or schizophrenia or depression. Mental health, everyone has mental health. It's just whether your mental health happens to be positive or negative in a certain situation, in a certain time period, because it's an aspect of our overall well-being, just as your physical health is. So just as you want to make sure your blood pressure is straight and you don't have high cholesterol and exercise regularly, things like that, you want to take care of your mental health as well. There are 4 designated components of having positive mental health, and they are life satisfaction. So basically how satisfied you are with your life in general. Are you able to enjoy your life? Do you have overall good wellness, connections to your work and your environment, things like that. Resilience is one as well, the ability to bounce back from adversity. Now, I almost take a little, I almost don't like to use the term resilient because I feel like there are some people, especially Black people, brown people, other racially marginalized groups that are expected to be more resilient than other people, like really are forced to be resilient because of constantly facing adversity. So at what point is resilience really more of a negative than a positive? I don't know. I'm not a mental health expert. I just know about mental health and work. But resilience is one of the characteristics. Social support, so whether you have friends, whether you have family, do you have people around you that can support you? Loneliness, especially in recent years, has been linked with both physical and mental health issues. So it's important to have some form of social support. And then flexibility, because if you have very rigid expectations of how things should be, how things should go, as a Virgo, I do have that. Sometimes it can sometimes create added stress. I want to specify before we go any further, or clarify rather, that in this session, I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm talking about general mental health overall. However, experiencing racial microaggressions can definitely lead to someone having a diagnosable mental illness, such as anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. Because experiencing those everyday constants like is, just adding to their negative mental health. And then of course, if you already live with a mental illness, experiencing these microaggressions at work can exacerbate the issue. Next slide, please. Now we have another poll. And Deborah, you can decide when to take it. Okey-dokey. Very good. The majority of you responded all of the above, and that is absolutely true. All of the above, as I just mentioned, could cause anxiety, could cause depression, cause a loss of confidence, because sometimes people start thinking, well, maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I am not suited for this role. Maybe I am not smart enough or good enough. Just developing a loss of confidence in your abilities because you're constantly receiving negative feedback. A loss of motivation in the sense that, you may have looked forward to going to work initially, and now you don't. Now you're not motivated to, volunteer, to be on committees or do projects or even do your regular job because you're constantly receiving this negative feedback. So it can absolutely affect your mental health in all of the reasons listed in the poll. Very good. That most of you guessed the right answer. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the impact of racial microaggressions. There are a number of factors that could increase the likelihood that a person may experience poor mental health. And two of these are definitely discrimination, and exposure to trauma. So not only can microaggressions lead to poor mental health, they can also require significant cognitive and emotional resources to recover from them. So not only are you experiencing the anxiety, the depression, the burnout, the withdrawal, you're also having to give additional emotional and mental resources to try to overcome those concerns so that you can continue to go on with your life. So that's like a double whammy. Like you're causing these issues, and then now I have to go outside of my regular life to try to address these issues so I don't go all the way down. Additionally, the previously mentioned amplified gender-based racial microaggressions that Black women tend to face in the workplace can cause severe psychological and workplace consequences. I've seen this play out in multiple workplaces where it's a vicious cycle of, you're constantly receiving this discrimination and these racial microaggressions to the point where it impacts your mental health. So your mental health being impacted makes you, not be as motivated, makes you depressed, makes you, antisocial. And then the conversation becomes, well, they're not right for this opportunity. They're not right for this promotion because they're all these things. And you weren't those things before. You're those things now because of the microaggressions you keep receiving. So it's a vicious cycle. Can be a vicious cycle. Next slide, please, Deborah. Okay, so these tables are supposed to have headers on them, but they're not showing up on the slide. So this is about what developing negative mental health because of racial microaggressions could look like. So the section on the left is about depression. Depression affects how a person feels, thinks, and behaves, and can interfere with their ability to function and carry on with daily life. So as you think, if you develop depression from, receiving these racial microaggressions at work, it can impact you in a lot of different ways. You could have mood swings. You could kind of have just a general discontent with the environment. You could become socially isolated. Like I say, you don't want to be around people. You may have been very social at work previously. Now you just want to go to your desk and not be bothered. You become irritable. You could have a change in your sleep patterns. And it can even go as far as to you having suicidal thoughts, depending on how severe the microaggressions have become. So that is an example of what depression could look like from this experience. The second section of the table is anxiety. And anxiety disorders cause people to experience distressing and frequent bouts of fear and apprehension. So some people experience anxiety short term because of they're going on a job interview, or they have a doctor's appointment, or they're doing public speaking. But if you are experiencing anxiety around going to work or being at work or interacting with certain people at work because of racial microaggressions, or even an overall kind of toxic racialized environment, it could lead to you having panic attacks. It could lead to you having physical symptoms, because as I said, mental health impacts physical health. So nausea, headaches, stomach aches, just various random aches and pains. You could have nightmares. You could begin to have obsessive thoughts. And then you could also begin to have, fear that you didn't have before. Fear of being called out, fear of being the center of attention, fear that whenever you're in a space with a group of people, you're somehow going to be picked on, because that's the experience that you've been having, and you develop an anxiety about that. if you have this anxiety for 6 months or more, it could be a diagnosed case of anxiety. Next slide, please. So the first left section is about stress. Stress is a feeling of emotional, physical tension. And people with chronic stress tend to end up with having situations such as heart attacks or strokes as a physical thing, or as a mental concern, they could develop suicidal thoughts, depression, they could also develop headaches, or they could become irritable and violent. There's a lot of different ways that just consistent chronic stress could impact you. Now, as we know, stress is something that people experience in life. Everyone experiences some type of stress, for some reason. It could be good or bad, but experiencing racial microaggressions at work can lead you to having chronic stress, because you know that every day when you go into the office, you're gonna have someone say something or do something, and it's based solely on your race, and it gives you an overall feeling of stress. Paranoia is the second one. And commonly when we think about paranoia, we think about someone who has a fear that's not based in anything. Like, oh, they think people are talking about them. They think someone's, looking at them. They think they're being mistreated, and it's baseless. However, in the situation of experiencing microaggressions at work, it is not necessarily baseless. You could feel misunderstood because you are being misunderstood. When you try to share your experience with your supervisor or another leader in your workplace, they don't believe you. They think that you're making yourself a victim, or you're being too sensitive, or you could start to not trust people because you've seen how some people aren't worthy of trust, so now you just mistrust everyone, so you don't get caught up. And when you constantly feel that, that becomes like a form of paranoia. And then the third section is a withdrawal. And withdrawal is kind of funny because it's similar to what people are now referring to as quiet quitting or whatever, which is really just, you're just doing your job, or you're doing the bare minimum, and you're not going above and beyond. You're not looking to add on different tasks or different projects. You're just doing your job and trying to leave, and optimally trying to leave early, or trying to find a reason to call out, or trying to find another job so you can quit. So basically consciously taking different actions to kind of pull yourself away from the organization, because you're just trying to not have to deal with these microaggressions in any way, shape, or form. I also want to speak to burnout, which is very closely tied to stress. Burnout is defined as having feelings of physical and emotional exhaustion, which are usually stress related, but specific to your working conditions. It's important to note that as of 2019, the World Health Organization has actually classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon. So people who are experiencing burnout are actually now supported under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's very important to remember that if you are experiencing burnout, it is not because of you. It's not your individual problem. It's a problem of the environment that you're in, because it's very specific to workplace conditions. So make sure if you're starting to feel any of these symptoms, or you're starting to feel, very differently than you have felt previously, take a beat and think about, what am I going through? What can I change? What do I need for myself? And you may, what you need for yourself may actually be, to leave that space. And, as we always say, no job is worth your mental health. obviously it's easier for some people to leave than others, but at the end of the day, you know, no job is worth sacrificing your mental health. Next slide, please. So we've talked about racial microaggressions, we've talked about mental health, and we've talked about how racial microaggressions can impact your mental health. So now we're going to talk about what actions you can take if you experience, witness, or commit a microaggression. If you experience a microaggression, there's really three main ways you can react. You can either let it go because you decide that it's not even worth you getting into it. You can respond immediately because you feel like this absolutely has to be addressed right now. They need to know that this action or this comment is absolutely offensive and unacceptable. Or you can respond later, which some people do choose to do if you're in a group and you feel like it might be better to address the person privately or, you know, at a later time individually. It's really up to the person who has experienced the microaggression to decide how they want to handle it. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who's really taking on the responsibility of trying to have a conversation with a person who has said or done something that is offensive. So if you don't have the emotional energy to do that at all, that's fine. If you don't have the energy to do it immediately, that's fine. Or if you think it's just not the right time immediately, that's fine. However you choose to handle it, it's fine because you're the person who has been offended. If you do decide to call the person out or, you know, respond to them about it, you want to make sure that you start the conversation if it isn't something that is like super egregious. If it's a comment that, you know, a lot of people say, and so they think there's nothing wrong with it, but you want to inform them that there is something.
Take this pill and the pain of childbirth will be.
Jesus. You want to be sure to let them know the impact of the statement or behavior. You want to start off by saying, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that you're racist. I'm saying that what you said or what you did was an inappropriate comment or action, and you need to know that. So I want to inform you of that. But you also want to decide how far you want to go with the conversation. So again, if you're taking on the responsibility of trying to educate someone about this, then you can decide whether you want to just tell them it was inappropriate or offensive and move on, or if you really want to educate them deeply about why it was inappropriate and, you know, give them books they can read and, you know, have further conversations, however you want to handle it. Some people want to go into a deep conversation. Some people just want to let the person know, look, you know, you did this, it was offensive to me, you know, let's move on. I personally believe that it's better to address it so that the person can know that they said or did something wrong, you know, because I feel like until they know, they might continue to do it. But if they continue to do it after you tell them, then you know it's intentional. Initially, it may not have been intentional. If you tell them and they continue to do it, then you know it is intentional, and then you know how, you know, to carry the relationship with that individual. It can definitely be psychologically or emotionally exhausting to decide that you want to be the educator of every white person on racial issues and microaggressions and discrimination and things like that. So, you know, you definitely have the right to pick and choose how you want to handle it if you experience it. But, you know, these are basically the three main ways. Next slide, please. So I came across this framework for addressing microaggressions, which I think is very helpful as kind of like an easy thing to remember, like the 4 Ds: discern, disarm, defy, and decide. And it's basically just what I explained to you just now, but kind of breaking it down into something that's easy to remember. So you decide how much of an investment you want to make in it. You explain, if you do decide to address it, you explain that it might be an uncomfortable conversation, but what they said, exactly right, Pamela. That's why I said decide whether you feel comfortable in even addressing it, but then also think about how you will feel if you don't address it. So I would say think about both sides of the coin. So by disarming the person, you could explain that the conversation might get uncomfortable, but what they said or did was also uncomfortable for you. Again, like I said earlier, you could say, I'm not saying that you are necessarily a racist. I'm saying what you said, or not that you aren't necessarily a racist, but that you aren't necessarily intentionally racist, or that you did not intentionally make this comment to offend someone, but it did. And so, now we're going to have this conversation. Defy is challenging the person to clarify. So if someone says, one of the comments that we mentioned earlier, like, oh, how did you get this job? Or like, who did you have to know? Or, you're not smart enough for this role, or something of that nature. Challenge them by saying, like, what did you mean by that? Like, I heard what you said, but I want to clarify what you meant, how you intended that statement before I decide how I'm going to respond to that statement. And then, decide what it means for your life and for your career in that particular workplace to address it, and what it will take from you. So will it be an overwhelming emotional withdrawal or emotionally exhausting for you to address it, or will it mean that you'll have a better experience in the workplace if you address it? So really, take the time to think about how you want to address it. I don't think there's necessarily any wrong way. Out of the three main ways, let go, respond immediately, or respond later, it's really what you feel comfortable in doing. And just as someone just mentioned in the chat, if you're fearful of retaliation or something, you absolutely have the right to decide not to address it. Okay, cool. We're almost done, I think. So next slide, please. So what to do if you witness a microaggression? So this is, you see or hear someone else do something that is a racial microaggression, but you didn't actually do it yourself. Similar to if you experience, you can decide if you really want to bring it up with the person or if you don't. If you do, you can say to them, I'm not saying that you're being intentionally racist. I'm just talking about the impact of what you said or did. As always, impact is more important than intent. So whether or not the person intended to be offensive, if the impact is that they were, then that's what we have to, worry about. If you do decide to talk to them, you want to ask them how they're feeling after you share the impact. And again, realizing and understanding that you're sharing it from a witness point of view and not a person who experienced it point of view. So especially if you're a person who is not in the racial group of the person who experienced the microaggression, you want to be sure that you're explaining to the person that this is how it came across to you, even though you're not a member of that group. And then however they respond, you accept it and you move on. Don't necessarily have an expectation of how they'll respond. Since we're closing in on the end of time, I'll just move to the next one. Please, Deborah. So what to do if you commit a microaggression? So, as great as everyone wants to believe that they are, and you know, anti-racist and pro-DEI and all of those things, there's still a chance that you may commit a microaggression in the workplace. If you do, take a breath. You know, someone brings it up to you that you've committed this microaggression, take a breath. Don't immediately respond out of being defensive. Listen to the person, make sure that you're actually hearing what they're saying, why they were offended, and then sincerely apologize. Like, really think about it, you know, understand the offense, and then sincerely apologize to them. But don't go overboard apologizing so they can just be sure that you're like that you're anti-racist. Like, don't go into, no, I'm so sorry because my cousin's mother's brother's uncle is, you know, Black or Latin, or, you know, and so I would never do something like that. Like, just apologize for the offense that you made to that person, and commit to not doing it again. Commit to learning from it and not doing it again. Next slide, please. So, I also wanted to talk about how leaders should address microaggression. So first and foremost, they should have their own self-awareness and understanding of bias and where their biases are, and then lead by example in committing to not committing any microaggressions, but also informing staff that it's, you know, unacceptable behavior, that if it's done and it's brought to the offender, they should understand that it's unacceptable. Definitely provide training to employees on what microaggressions are. Excellent point, Robin. So what microaggressions are, and, you know, the consequences for them in the environment, you know, on the front end, or if you haven't already done so, do so. Develop an inclusive culture. So if someone does experience a microaggression, they can feel comfortable taking it to someone or letting them know this is what they've experienced, and know that it's going to be addressed somehow. Definitely allow racially marginalized employees to have a space to discuss their experiences with you and with, you know, in groups of themselves, so that you can get a better understanding of what specifically needs to be addressed in the workplace. And then definitely include in your policies and procedures, you know, or I should say, remove from your policies and procedures things that could be, that could cause disparate treatment to Black or Brown employees, and hire more of them in your senior leadership positions. Next slide, please. So last but certainly not least, I wanted to just go over some self-care and coping strategies. So as we said, experiencing these racial microaggressions on a regular basis can definitely cause harm to your own mental health. And to kind of prevent your mental health from going too far into the negative, you want to develop some self-care and some coping strategies that work for you. So you may already have those. You may need to come up with them, write a list of them down, keep it somewhere you can easily find it in your journal or by your desk or something like that, and go back to those coping strategies and that self-care whenever you need to, you know, whether it's taking time to relax, whether it's having affirmations, whatever it is, you know, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I believe that's it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I just want to thank everyone so much for attending. We do not have enough time for question and answer this time around, but just as a reminder, we are going to be back next month. Next month, we're going to be speaking to leveraging tech apprentices. Now, if you're still around and you have 30 seconds, please complete the post-event survey. It really helps us greatly as we continue to shape our programming for the time ahead. We have 2 more workshops this month. Next month, again, is leveraging tech apprenticeship, so please take advantage of that. And then afterwards, we will be concluding our Most Diverse Tech Hub workshop. In November, there will be a culmination of all of this with our Most Diverse Tech Hub Summit. So please, if you haven't already, continue to keep an eye out on Technically's website. We make a recap of every single one of these things after every single one of these workshops after each event. So please continue to visit our website. And we're so appreciative of your attendance today. Oh, thank you. Yes, please, if you have any questions, since we didn't get a chance to do the Q&A, please reach out. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. We hope to see you next month at Leveraging Tech Apprenticeships.
Thank you, everyone.